China.
China.
China. China.
China.
China.
China.
China.
China.
It's Donald Trump who's now escalating the trade war. Donald Trump has slapped a 100% tariff on China.
US stock markets have crashed today after Donald Trump threatened to impose new tariffs on China. The US president also threatening to call off a planned face-to-face meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
Donald Trump threatened China with tariffs, trade war, sanctions, decoupling. He promised pressure would force Beijing to give in, but it did not. And this is not about Trump as a person. It's about why China is structurally resistant to pressure from the United States. The American pressure model is simple. Create economic pain, disrupt stability, trigger political backlash, force negotiations. That logic works on allies. It works on small economies. It works on countries dependent on U.S. markets or U.S. security guarantees. China is built differently. Start with tariffs. Between 2018 and 2020, the United States imposed tariffs on roughly $360 billion worth of imports from China. The assumption was straightforward. Higher tariffs would crush Chinese exports. Factories would shut down. Unemployment would rise. Public pressure would reach Beijing. That chain reaction never materialized. Chinese exports to the United States dipped in some product categories, but China's overall global exports remained resilient. Instead of collapsing, trade rerouted. Production shifted partially to Vietnam, Mexico, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. Components crossed borders multiple times. Final assembly locations change. Ownership and control often remain Chinese. By the early 2020s, U.S. imports from Southeast Asia surged sharply, while Chinese firms expanded operations across those same countries. Tariffs didn't remove China from supply chains. They pushed China deeper into them. Tariffs didn't end Chinese trade. They changed its routing. Now look at who paid the cost. Multiple U.S. economic studies concluded that most tariff costs were absorbed inside the United States. Importers paid more. Consumers paid more. Input costs rose across industries. Prices increased. Inflation pressure followed. Political pressure built quickly. China absorbed the shock more slowly and spread the pain internally. Pressure reached Washington faster than Beijing. That is not how economic coercion is supposed to work. Now manufacturing. China is not just a low-cost exporter. Today, China accounts for roughly 20 to 27% of global manufacturing output, depending on how it's measured. No other country is even close. The United States produces roughly 15 to 16%, but the headline number misses the real advantage. Depth is the advantage. China controls entire production layers, intermediate components, industrial chemicals, electronics assembly, battery materials and cells, machinery ecosystems. In many industries, China controls 60% or more of global capacity at critical stages of production. That matters more than final exports, because final products are replaceable. Production ecosystems are not. Pressure only works when alternatives exist. In many cases, they don't. Take batteries. China dominates the processing of lithium, cobalt, and graphite. It controls the majority of global battery cell production. It anchors the electric vehicle supply chain. You can subsidize factories elsewhere. You cannot replicate decades of integration quickly. Take electronics. China assembles a large share of the world's consumer electronics. But more importantly, it produces the inputs, the subcomponents, and the industrial tooling behind them. Moving the final assembly is easy. Rebuilding the entire upstream network is not. Take rare earths. China produces about 70% of global rare earth mining output. But mining is not the real leverage. China controls around 85 to 90% of rare earth processing and refining capacity. Processing is the choke point. You can reopen mines elsewhere. You cannot rebuild processing ecosystems overnight. Those took decades to develop. This is why pressure fails. Tariffs raise costs. They do not remove capacity. Sanctions block access. They do not erase ecosystems. Manufacturing power is cumulative. Once built, it is extremely hard to unwind. That is the structural reality. China doesn't win because it avoids pain. It wins because pain does not dismantle the system. And that is why pressure based on disruption produces adjustment instead of collapse. Now, time horizons. U.S. policy runs on elections. Every 4 years, leadership changes. Every 2 years, Congress intervenes. Markets react instantly. Voters punish pain quickly. China operates on long planning cycles. Industrial strategies span 10, 20, even 30 years. Factories are subsidized through losses. Overcapacity is tolerated. Employment is protected for social stability. Short-term pain is acceptable if long-term capacity survives. That asymmetry matters. Political structure amplifies this difference. In the United States, economic pain becomes political risk. Unemployment flips elections. Market crashes force policy reversals. In China, economic pain is managed internally. Media narratives are controlled. Dissent is contained. Losses are absorbed by the system. There is no electoral penalty for endurance. Threats rely on visible public backlash. China prevents backlash from scaling. That is why pressure behaves differently, not because China is immune to pain, but because pain does not translate into immediate political collapse. In the United States, economic pain becomes political risk. Inflation ends careers. Unemployment flips elections. Market crashes force policy reversals. Pain shows up fast, and voters respond faster. In China, economic pain is handled internally. Media is centralized. Narratives are managed. Dissent is contained. Losses are absorbed by the system, not converted into public revolt. There is no electoral penalty for endurance. Threats depend on visible public backlash. China suppresses backlash before it spreads. That alone breaks the pressure model. Now sanctions. Sanctions are designed to deny access. Technology, capital, components. The assumption is simple: cut access and capability collapses. That's not what happened. When Chinese firms were cut off from advanced U.S. chips, they didn't disappear. China responded by increasing domestic semiconductor investment by tens of billions of dollars every year. Progress was slow at first, then incremental, then persistent. Domestic tools replaced foreign ones. Supply chains localized. Learning curves flattened. Once capability exists, leverage disappears. Sanctions accelerate self-reliance. Self-reliance ends pressure. This pattern repeats across sectors. Restricted from software, domestic platforms expand. Blocked from equipment, local substitutes emerge. Cut off from finance, alternative payment systems grow. Pressure doesn't freeze China. It forces adaptation. Now the domestic market. U.S. pressure assumes China depends on exports to survive. That was true decades ago. Today, China has a domestic market of over 1.4 billion people, with a middle class larger than the entire U.S. population. Consumption does not replace exports completely, but it cushions shocks. Factories can redirect output inward. Employment can be stabilized. Losses can be spread. That option alone weakens external threats. Now decoupling. In Washington, decoupling is framed as leverage. In Beijing, it's treated as inevitability. Supply chains are diversified deliberately. Trade partners are expanded steadily. Exposure to the U.S. market is reduced over time. Pressure works best when it surprises. China stopped being surprised years ago. This is why Trump-style threats work better elsewhere. Allies fear abandonment. Small states fear collapse. Export-dependent economies fear isolation. Controlled China fears inconvenience, not systemic failure. It absorbs pain, spreads losses, waits out election cycles. This leads to the core misunderstanding. The U.S. treats China like a country. China behaves like an industrial ecosystem. You can threaten a government. You cannot intimidate a system designed for endurance. Calm authority systems don't panic, they adjust. So when Trump threatened China, Beijing didn't flinch. Trade routes shifted. Factories adapted. Technology investment accelerated. The pressure exposed limits, not Chinese weakness, American leverage. And this doesn't end with Trump. Any U.S. president faces the same structural problem. Threats require leverage. Leverage requires dependency. Dependency requires the absence of alternatives. China has spent decades removing dependency. China has real problems: debt, demographics, inefficiency. But those are internal constraints. External pressure doesn't collapse the system, it reorganizes it. Modern power is not about how loud the threat is. It's about how much pressure a system can absorb without breaking. China absorbs pressure differently. That is why Trump's threats failed.